Welcome back to the Real News Network coverage of the inauguration of President Barack Obama. And as we saw earlier, it wasn't long ago that President Bush took off in his helicopter and waved goodbye to 8 years. 8 years of a foreign policy that has seen a war in Iraq, a war in Afghanistan, almost potential confrontation with Iran. Some people think a deliberate encirclement, isolation of Russia, pointing to missiles in Poland and radar system in the Czech Republic. Barack Obama is going to face some rather serious foreign policy changes. Of course, the hottest and most important in front of him will be the Israeli-Palestine conflict, which he did not mention in the speech, and at least in the Arab world and much of the world, people have been wondering why he's been somewhat silent on the question of Gaza. So a lot of questions facing President Obama, and to help us sort out what they thought of the speech and where the Obama foreign policy might take us, I'm joined by Gareth Porter. Gareth is a historian and a journalist, and sometimes he calls himself an investigative historian, which is, I think, an interesting title. We're also joined by Nina Hechigian, and I'm going to ask Nina, did I get it right?
You got it perfect.
I got it right. That's good. Nina Hechigian. Nina is at the Center for American Progress and used to be a fellow at the RAND Corporation. And also joining us is Glenn Ford. Glenn is editor of the Black Agenda Report, and to give it a proper plug, it's blackagendareport.com. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So just to get into it, Nina, why don't you kick us off? How'd you react to the speech? I'm assuming you've been out campaigning and fighting, and this must feel pretty good.
Yeah, no, it felt great, and the energy of the crowd was exciting. I found myself, overcome at times. I thought the content was pretty terrific, and it also just, the realization that we actually are going to have a new president whose foreign policy I feel like I can really believe in, at least at this point, is incredibly refreshing and a big relief.
Now, when you say a foreign policy you can believe in, do you take him at his word? And I say this in this way, that there's a lot of people have been saying throughout the campaign, particularly in the more progressive sector of the movement that elected Barack Obama, because there's a pretty wide spectrum of people that bought into electing him, and within that spectrum, a lot of disagreements about what they think he should actually do. Mm-hmm. So when you say the foreign policy you think he's going to carry out, or the foreign policy he actually articulated in the campaign? So, like, for example, the speech at AIPAC.
I don't have reason to doubt at this point he's been consistent as far as I've followed him, and he. I have no reason to doubt that he will continue to be. I mean, I think that his general stances are reflective of a broad community of policy analysts who have been pushing for 8 years in a direction that the Bush administration just didn't want to go. And so it's, I have no reason not to think that he isn't going to carry out what he says he is and try to build a more, generally cooperative, collaborative kind of foreign policy than we've seen.
Glenn, how did you feel today? And I know I don't think you supported Obama.
You're correct.
And so why don't you explain how you felt today and what you made of the speech? And looking ahead on the foreign policy.
Yeah, I'd like to separate the speech from the event. This massive pilgrimage in terms of Black America. This has amounted to a kind of Hajj, that pilgrimage that Muslims must make to Mecca once in their lives. Well, it really had the cultural characteristics of an African American Hajj, with probably 1 million African Americans coming to this event. And so, of course, one gets carried away with the Hajj, with the event, with seeing comrades and family and folk. And in that sense, it was a singular experience. In terms of the speech, it was an anti-aircraft flak gun of signals that can be variously interpreted and are formulated in ways that they can be explained without taking any position whatsoever. But that means it's a good political speech.
Gareth.
Well, I think there is something to what Glenn has just said about the speech. I actually sort of like that metaphor, if you will. Or is it a simile? I guess it's a metaphor. And I do tend to view Barack Obama a bit more as a Machiavellian politically. That is to say, he is perfectly capable and indeed very good at taking positions rhetorically which he knows are going to be useful for a political purpose, and which he takes, he formulates in ways that give him enough flexibility later on to do something different from what it appears he might be likely to do based on the rhetoric. I would just give a couple of examples. I mean, one is, in terms of his Machiavellianism, when he forbade any blacks or African Americans from being in the front rows of one of his campaign events, he was obviously being politically Machiavellian in terms of projecting an image and avoiding certain other images for the purpose of
But in
his
that
campaign.
context, nobody gets elected that isn't politically Machiavellian.
Well, I think that there's
he
something
was
to
just
that,
pretty-
but
very
I'm
good at it.
suggesting that he is perhaps more than most candidates really good at it, very thoughtful, very strategic. I liken him to John F. Kennedy in regard to this characteristic, and particularly I'm thinking of this in terms of foreign policy, because Kennedy, I would say that Obama, like Kennedy when he was campaigning for the presidency, did strike a posture of toughness. In a way, sort of positioned himself to the right in some ways of his opponent. In the case of Obama, he made a great deal of Afghanistan, saying that the Republicans weren't tough enough on Afghanistan, they weren't doing enough. At the same time, of course, he was calling for withdrawal from Iraq, but he was very conscious of the need, or his felt need to do that. On Pakistan, I think that Obama, during the campaign, struck a posture that he felt would, perhaps mark him as having a tough posture
Right.
on that issue. So what struck me about the speech, just to complete the thought, to bring it full circle, is that it really was very much more striking a tone and to some extent content of very limited aims, particularly in terms of U.S. military commitment. Particularly on Iraq, of course, he talked about withdrawal and leaving it to the Iraqis. This is not a rhetoric that he had used during the campaign. It was withdrawing from the war, but not leaving it to Iraqis. On Afghanistan, it was forging a peace, although he did say hard fought. The fact that he used that term rather than a generational commitment or some of the other.
Or we're going to kill bin Laden, which has been
Or we're
some of
going
the
to kill
campaign
bin Laden.
rhetoric.
Exactly. I thought that was significant. And finally, in terms of his posture toward Iran, what is missing from the speech, it seems to me, that's very significant, is any signal or any indication that he is, preparing for a campaign of pressure against Iran to prevent it from having a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say just that although he did make a point, about specifically about nonproliferation and about limiting the use of nuclear weapons and doing
Yes.
it with our,
Right.
with our former foes and doing it with our allies, and so, I think in general, I think part of the point you're making is that it was, or that both of you are making, that it was a lot of generalities, but these are generalities that distinguish him so distinctly from the Bush administration. I mean, the phrase that really stuck with me was, our power alone cannot protect us, which is something you'd never hear out of the Bush administration. I mean, their paradigm was all about American power, particularly American military power, and that if we were strong enough, that we would be able to be safe. And throughout the campaign and also in this speech, I think Barack Obama is very clear that our military power and our power in general is not enough, that the threats that we face today demand cooperation and collaboration, even with our former enemies. So if we're going to try to prevent a nuclear attack on an American city by a terrorist, we have to work with Russia to secure their loose nuclear material. And we might not like that, but it's a fact. And so that kind of focus on the fact that we have to have a security that reaches across nations and that our military strength is not adequate is really different, I think.
Well, one of the things I
so
find.
do you think by omission by the omission of saber rattling, Obama made that created a more modest tone, at the very least, in terms of U.S. foreign policy.
One would have to agree with that. I believe that what's fascinating about Obama and his singular skills is that every position that he takes has an exit strategy embedded in the language. And that may be reassuring to some people. I find it quite discomforting.
For example?
For example, I'd like to point to one of the things he said that I find intriguing. He said that we should follow our better history. And that's really an intriguing phrase. It seems a call to revisionism, possibly. I will revise the history. Or is he saying that he will pick and choose from more progressive examples of U.S. policy? I don't know. I tend to think, however, that it means that we will put forward our better face, that we will focus on the kind of setting of a more peaceful tone in the world, as opposed to bellicosity and those things we associate with George Bush. But is tone policy? What is he going to do with the 100,000 additional Marines and soldiers that he has called for the U.S. military? Soldiers are there to be deployed, and you can use any tone you want, but you're going to send them somewhere. And that's the substance that we're looking for.
In the next segment of our interview, let's dig into the substantial policy areas he's going to have to deal with. And particularly, has he bought into and continuing the war on terrorism rhetoric, or is he broken with it? And I'm left guessing on that one too. Please join us for the next segment of our panel on Barack Obama's foreign policy.